Canada's economy depends to a large extent on its ability to sell energy, cars, minerals, and other goods to the US. So it's no surprise that President-elect Donald Trump's promise of across-the-board import duties on everything the US buys will rattle the entire North American region. One sector that could be affected is Canada's critical minerals sector. We're joined now by Akshay Dubey, who is CEO at CVW Cleantech. Thanks very much for coming on the show.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
Before we get going, just tell us what your business model is at the company. What do you do in clean technology?
CVW Cleantech has developed a made-in-Canada technology to reprocess the tailings or waste from mining oil sands operations. Today, the mining oil sands space produces about 1.5 million barrels a day of oil. For every barrel of oil it produces 2 barrels of waste. We can reprocess that waste and recover both hydrocarbons that are lost in their process, as well as critical minerals. By doing so, reduce their fugitive methane emissions by over 90%, or their CO2 emissions by 5 to 10%, and then produce a clean tailings product that no longer needs to go into a tailings pond and can go through end-of-life remediation. So really, it's an environmental technology that provides a step change in their environmental sustainability for tailings, but does it in a way that produces positive economics through the recovery of both hydrocarbons and critical minerals.
And you also invest, you have a royalty play or a plan to invest, to buy royalties in tech companies. Tell us very quickly, if you would, what that's about.
Yeah, this is a recent strategy that we've employed to really turn CVW Cleantech into a diversified clean technology royalty platform. Our own creating value from waste, or CVW technology, we expect to deploy along the oil sands and receive long-term cash flow streams similar to a royalty from that technology. And we are also looking to invest in other technologies that sustainably produce the commodities the world needs while reducing their carbon impact. And so we made our first royalty investment this summer in a company called North Star Clean Technologies.
Now, the term critical minerals covers a vast range of substances, but there is a risk, you think, that a Trump administration brings in tariffs that could affect our mineral industry?
Well, certainly it's something that we are monitoring, and this shows how critical, no pun intended, the relationship between Canada and the U.S. is. Obviously, with previously NAFTA and now the USMCA, these free trade agreements cover a lot of the trade that takes place between these countries. Certainly, we feel Canadian minerals and natural resources are key for the United States to be able to produce goods and services, as Donald Trump and the current policy in the U.S. thinks about bringing jobs back onshore within the United States. At the same time, this underlines the fact that Canada needs to be more resilient and certainly need to be thinking about how we can move our industry in a direction where we aren't dependent on the trade policy of our neighbor to the south.
What are a couple of strategies you think this country should adopt?
I'd say first and most importantly, we need to build domestic refining capacity as well as domestic manufacturing capacity. For a long period of time, historically, Canada has always been a natural resource producing nation, but a lot of the value-added goods and services are produced either in the U.S. or elsewhere. So to create a vertically integrated industry where we can take advantage of the resources we produce here in Canada will provide us protection from these sorts of situations, but also lead to stronger economic growth in the long term.
You may have noticed that Jim Balsillie, formerly of Research in Motion / BlackBerry, he's been going on for years about the fact that in this country we don't seem to take intellectual property seriously. I mean, for example, we'll subsidize some battery maker from Sweden, but they're going to own the intellectual property. So it seems like Balsillie has a point there.
I would tend to agree with that. I think the federal and provincial government have great programs in place to support industry. We have seen some of that capital flow into companies from other places as well. I think the key driver there is to really have those companies invest in Canada and create operations that then employ Canadians. But we should be having an emphasis and a focus on Canadian businesses, because made in Canada technology has that ability to create a long-term sustainable advantage for our industry here that not only creates jobs in the short term, but then really allows us to utilize the strength of that industry to create further growth down the road, which doesn't take place when that intellectual property sits abroad.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because Balsillie argues that this is now the world's crucial commodity, intellectual property, design of things. Tell us as well, often the offtake agreements, so that's the dream of some critical mineral producers, and sometimes you have to do that. You have to find an offtake partner. Is there a risk that we're just dealing with a global resource company or a miner or a battery maker, which really doesn't think much about Canada, just to get value, get minerals out of us, but it's not thinking of a long-term commitment to this country?
Look, I think that's certainly the case. I think it's something that the federal government has been thinking about more and more so in terms of reviewing M&A that takes place within the critical minerals industry and more broadly, and seeing if it's a net benefit to Canada. That has created some headwinds for companies in the space. Who are now, it's unclear what the rules of engagement are in terms of being able to partner or sell your asset to companies abroad. But all of that comes back to the fact that if we are going to generate a very strong critical minerals industry like we do in Canada, we do need to provide them the tools and the opportunities to be able to grow that industry. And that's where investment in creating downstream capacity here in Canada really can unlock that industry and create that competitive advantage over the long term.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Akshay Dubey, CEO at CVW